Hello and welcome to the Health Report with me, Norman Swan. Today, a special feature from Hagar Cohn on a very important issue for many parents. It's stillbirths. They can be reduced and are preventable, as was shown on a recent background briefing by Hagar Cohn. But what Hagar has also found is that when stillbirths occur, there may be unacceptable variation in how they're dealt with by hospitals. Some of the statements and descriptions you'll hear in this programme could be disturbing, but it is an important issue. Here's Hagar Cohn's feature.
It was early in the morning that Karen Anderson, a professional photographer, received an urgent text from the hospital.
We are off to the Mater at St Leonard's. I received a call to say that there'd been a stillbirth and to come in and take some photographs for the family.
Karen is a volunteer with the Heartfelt Foundation. They photograph families that have experienced premature births or have children with terminal illnesses, or like in this instance, a stillbirth. It's not a job for the faint-hearted.
Some babies have their skin has torn during birth, or they had passed away in utero a little while ago, so their skin is not very well.
Not all stillborn babies look like this. Karen was told that the stillborn baby this morning looks perfect.
Yes, exactly. Some babies look exactly perfect. Their skin is perfect, and it's hard to sort of realise that the baby has passed away and it just doesn't seem to be for any reason.
Karen says parents usually feel apprehensive posing with their dead baby, but she says later they're glad they did it.
It must be quite confronting to sort of say to a family, you know, would you like someone to come in and take photographs of your baby? But I think even through that grief, a lot of parents realise that they may not have any memories if nobody has taken any photographs, and to have a professional come in and take photographs that they could sometimes even put up on their wall if they wanted to, I think it's just very important.
Arriving at the Mater Hospital, Karen is greeted by social worker Deb de Wilde. It's the third time they've met in 10 days. There's been a rush of stillborns, almost like a cluster.
Yeah, I guess you could describe it as a cluster, though I don't know that using that term in the kind of medical or epidemiological sense is actually accurate. But yes, in that sense, yeah, I guess you could say a cluster.
The family at the Mater today are spending time with their baby Chloe. It's a practice that's encouraged by many hospitals, and parents Han and Matt have opted to stay and look after baby Chloe at the hospital for 7 days.
So it's got daddy's softness, which we think is probably how her personality would have been.
This may seem unusual, and for Han and Matt, this experience is full of unknowns. But Deb de Wilde, a social worker with over 30 years' experience, guides them along the process.
You know, you've had a really big day and going to be quite bossy now.
Today, the day before the funeral, Han and Matt are debating whether Chloe should stay overnight for a sleepover.
We're leaning against the sleepover because tomorrow is such a big day that if we don't sleep tomorrow, we're not actually going to be very...
So we might revisit the temazepam idea, or...?
No, I'm just worried that if you don't get enough sleep, everything's hyper. And her last day is not...
It's all around negotiation. You just do what you ultimately tell me.
So we're thinking, Deb, maybe we have her now, then we'll take a break, have her after dinner, and then put her in from, say, 11 till 6.
Cool.
Chloe was stillborn 6 days ago, and since then, Han and Matt have been looking after her like any other parent would, dressing her, bathing her, and once they even took her for a walk.
So we got to take Chloe out to a nearby garden, just a little quiet private one. Yeah, and just sort of hang out with her, show her, you know, the sunshine, I guess, the flowers, fresh air, and that's been pretty special. If we're going to have Chloe with us for a week, it feels a bit strange to not change her clothes. We would change our clothes, right?
Yeah, and to us, you know, she's alive. Well, she's not alive, but to us, she's our baby. Yeah. So she's going to have all of the things that all babies should have, aren't you, my darling? Yeah. Do you want to touch her?
Yeah.
You can touch her.
Chloe is cold to touch, and that's because she goes in and out of a fridge.
Oh, you are super, super cold, little Chloe. Super cold today. It's good. That means you can stay out and hang out longer.
Mother Han had a textbook pregnancy, and she still doesn't know why Chloe died.
She was born on Saturday night and she had her autopsy on Wednesday.
Did you get answers?
Not yet.
Not yet. I think it'll be a while.
But whether we get her autopsy now or in 3 months, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change the outcome.
The outcome, having a stillborn, is something that no one prepares for. So it was the social worker Deb de Wilde who talked them through what they could do with the baby.
We have no idea. We have no idea. And she just slowly, in great comfort, and it makes us feel very relaxed about it, I guess. And all these things you just don't think about, like obviously the funeral process, but everything from can we go outside, can we hold her, can we change her, can we take her home, or can we...
She throws options at you that you don't even think are possible.
Yeah.
Like, do you know that you could take her home tonight?
Or we could have her here overnight in like the little cot. I can only hope this sort of thing happens in not just private hospitals, but public and everywhere, because, man, if it didn't, I've got a feel for those parents.
If other parents don't get this, what do they do?
That was just absolutely horrific to me, and my mind just shut down, and I just went, I have to get out of here. I just wanted to get out of there, and yeah, it was horrific. And I felt in that moment that our baby belonged to the hospital, and it wasn't my baby. Obviously, they saw him as a specimen, and that's how he was presented to us. Yeah.
This mum's experience shows that while some parents are given the golden standard, others are exposed to so much apathy and carelessness that it traumatises them for life. Vita, who gave birth at Westmead Hospital in Sydney, spent only a few minutes with her stillborn baby, Frankie James.
Did you get to touch Frankie?
I touched the call, I think, briefly when he was still in the call, but no, I didn't know.
And that's your biggest regret?
Yes, my biggest regret is that I didn't spend that precious time with him, even though he passed away. And it was a scary situation. He was still my baby, and that was the only chance I got to see his little body. And I missed it. Yeah.
We'll hear more from Vita later in the program. But across Australia, 6 babies are stillborn every day. The care and support for their parents in some hospitals is often neglected. To draw attention to this, the Stillbirth Foundation has commissioned a study to assess the economic impact of stillbirth to our health system. The Stillbirth Foundation is an organisation that funds research into stillbirth. Most of its funding comes from bereaved parents. Foundation President Victoria Bowring says that the study, which is due to be released in October, has found stillbirth is costing the economy millions.
It will be in the hundreds of millions. Stillbirth is not just an issue that needs to be dealt with by the families who experience it. It's an issue that we should all be concerned about. The cost to the families, to society, is enormous and long-term, and some families never recover from the financial burden that stillbirth has, which is just an added trauma that goes with the tragedy of the loss of their child. It's indicative of how it's quite a compounding loss, and hopefully through indicating that there is a financial burden associated with stillbirth for the economy, we may be able to get government to take it more seriously.
Over the past few years, Victoria Bowring says she's lobbied health departments to prioritise training for hospital staff. She says it's been a fruitless exercise and there's been very little investment from government in this area. An economic impact study into stillbirth may seem cold, but Victoria says she feels it's a pragmatic way to make people stand up and listen. She wants to suggest that an investment now is a cost saving in the long run.
It's sad that we live in a time where to be able to exhibit a cost of something gives greater leverage in having it dealt with. but it's the reality of the way things work, and sometimes we need to work with that in order to get the result that we need.
The result we need is not only a better service at the hospital, but also better follow-up care when the parents return home. Researchers from Sydney University and the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital interviewed 35 mothers after stillbirth. They found a high level of dissatisfaction.
I'm talking about 9 tertiary hospitals in the Sydney area, so not just one centre, but generally we found that the follow-up care was such that families were seen sporadically. Some families slipped through the cracks and were not seen.
Diana Bond is the researcher with the Sydney Stillbirth Study who interviewed the mums. She says that many of them felt the clinicians they got in their follow-up appointments were careless.
Often they were seen by a clinician that they had not met before. Very often it might have been a junior registrar or somebody who was not familiar with their history. So they felt they were often seen in an antenatal clinic, which meant that they were surrounded by pregnant women and had to wait a long time, and they found that very confronting. It's very traumatizing for them to go back to that clinic, which was a scene of their pregnancy, and it brought back a lot of traumatic memories. And the appointments were often rushed. A lot of the results that they wanted to hear about were not there. They had to repeat their story and explain why they were there. So it was not ideal for them. They found it actually quite traumatizing.
Can you give me an example?
I remember somebody received a home visit from a midwife who was not aware of their situation and walked in the door and said, "And so how's the baby doing?" And it took a while before she realised that the baby had died.
Not all parents experience this kind of treatment. The Sydney Stillbirth Study found that some parents were looked after by sensitive clinicians and others were being let down and traumatised. To address this problem, Diana Bond convinced the RPA to lend them a space for a special clinic that will look after parents 6 weeks after a stillbirth. But no one would fund it, so the local RSL stepped in.
We're so grateful to the Canterbury Park RSL for funding the clinic. After the stillbirth study, our dream was to start this clinic and realise it was absolutely just such a necessary part of care. The hospital at the time were gracious in providing us a room, and the Canterbury RSL were looking for a project to support, and they provided seed funding for 2 years.
This clinic, called Integrated Support After Infant Loss, or ISAIL, opened last year and already has 60 parents on their books. Julia, whose daughter Anna was stillborn at 20 weeks, is one of them.
So Diana Bond from the ISAIL clinic contacted me on a Friday night, and then we spoke for a while, and she booked in an appointment to meet us, like a debrief. So I'd written 101 questions that I wanted to ask, and I really felt like they gave us as much time as we needed.
For an hour and a half, Julia's obstetrician and her midwife discussed all of those questions. All Julia wanted to know was her daughter's death preventable.
If I had have gone private, could this have changed? If I had have gone to hospital sooner, could this have changed?
So you wanted to know if it was preventable?
Yeah, basically if it was preventable. And, the doctor that I saw at the medical centre on that Monday morning, did she misinform me?
Julia's loss was the most traumatic event in her life, but she feels supported. That's not what happened to Vita, who plunged into a black hole after the birth and death of her first son, Frankie James.
And I went into a very dark depression after that, and it was a real struggle.
Vita's partner, Peter, was worried.
For quite some time, she was barely leaving the house. I'd sometimes get home from work and she wouldn't have had anything to eat or drink all day, and I was like, oh boy, it's pretty serious.
Peter and Vita now live with their 2 babies. In 2012, when Vita was pregnant with Frankie, she was over the moon. But at the 19-week scan, she discovered he died.
And I remember I was lying on the table and the lady doing the ultrasound, her face kind of froze and she seemed to be taking quite a long time. And then she said, I just have to check something, and she left the room. And then she came back with another person who said, I'm sorry, but your baby's heart isn't beating. They left the room and I remember I just screamed like an animal.
Baby Frankie died at the point where it's still considered a miscarriage, just. So Vita was told to wait for her body to miscarry at home. She was scared.
I was terrified. When I came out of the shock, I realised I've got this dead baby inside me and I've got to get it out somehow. Now. It was just a horrible thought to think that my womb had become a tomb.
After 3 days at home, waiting, still no miscarriage. So Vita went to the hospital.
And I had an amniocentesis done, which is where they put a needle into the tummy and extract the fluid around the baby to test it. And I remember I went into that room and lay down and there were 2 doctors talking about their weekend. I was crying and they were saying, no, stop crying, you can have another one, don't cry. And I just felt bereft. I felt like I was being difficult by being upset. They couldn't understand why I was sad.
3 days later, with still no miscarriage, Vita decided to give birth to Frankie. Her labour was painful and lasted 16 hours.
At one stage, one of the hospital midwives came in and she seemed quite annoyed with me and she said, there are women here having live babies and it's not all about you.
Another midwife who took over Vita's care was lovely but inexperienced. She started her shift when Vita was asleep after having an epidural.
And then I remember her coming in and sort of tapping me on the shoulder and waking me up and saying, I'm just going to check to see how you're progressing. And she lifted up the covers and, exposed my legs and she screamed and jumped backwards and said, oh, it's happened. She was absolutely horrified, terrified and surprised.
Because the baby had come out and no one knew?
Yeah. I didn't even know. And it was just there in between my knees. And she said, wait there, don't touch, don't look at it, don't look at it, don't look. And, she ran out of the room.
The midwife ran out to call for some help. She came back with an obstetrician.
He, I think, lifted our little son up and showed him to us for like 10 seconds. It was a very short amount of time. And he was actually inside the caul, so he was inside the amniotic sac. It hadn't burst. And I thought he was incredibly beautiful and magical, and to see this sort of sack surrounding him was quite a miracle, really. And then the obstetrician took him away.
Vita says from then on, everything happened very quickly.
I remember kind of going, what just happened? Where's he taken him? A while later he came back and he'd burst the sack and our baby was sitting in a metal kidney dish, like an organ. And he brought him back in this kidney dish and he took a pen out of his pocket and he kind of poked him with the pen and was pointing out this is where the umbilical cord is. And yeah, he was trying to explain what all the bits were to us in front of us, but just, again, in a very insensitive manner, in a kidney dish with his pen.
Frankie James was born at 19 weeks and 6 days. Officially, he was a miscarriage, 1 day short of a stillbirth. That meant no birth certificate, no death certificate. Officially, he didn't exist, nor was a heartfelt photographer called.
I asked for photos and we were given 3 photos which were taken, with a flash, and they were just horrible, like post-mortem type photos.
So they didn't call a photographer, like from the Heartfelt Foundation?
No, and I didn't know about that, and I wish I had known, and I would have loved to have had that service. That would have been wonderful, but I didn't know about it. And the photos that we have, I can't stand to look at them. They're awful.
Vita and Peter left hospital on the day Frankie James was born. They spent only a few moments with him. What happened at Westmead is exactly what social worker Deb de Wilde would like to prevent. She explains to parents who are usually in shock that they can spend time and touch their baby.
There's nothing particularly new about this approach. It's just legitimising it within a hospital. I think we have many cultural black holes in our society, and one of them is around death, and particularly the death of a child. That's why the people I see have no kind of cultural reference point and no inner knowledge to guide them about what they should think or feel or do. And that's why sometimes you need a wise older presence to perhaps slow things down long enough so that people can get to a point where they know for themselves what they need to do around that little baby.
Deb's relationship with parents usually starts just after they're told that their baby has died.
So often, I guess the most usual scenario for me would be just knocking on a delivery suite door and walking into a room to see people who are often either extraordinarily distressed, tearful, angry, but most often composed, incredulous, disbelieving. So then sometimes it's just trying to backtrack a little bit and explain my role and to say to them in effect that, look, I'm going to see them quite a lot over their time in hospital and that I'm going to do everything I can to make this situation bearable.
And with these words, Deb de Wilde first introduced herself to Katrina. Katrina was 39 weeks pregnant when she arrived at the hospital with what she thought were normal contractions. But she was wrong. She'd had a placental abruption, which is when the placenta comes away from the wall of the uterus and the baby's supply of blood stops. She'd lost a lot of blood and was about to be anaesthetised for an emergency caesarean. Doctors told her the baby was dead. On top of that, Katrina was scared she was going to die.
But what was going through my mind at that point was literally just that I had absolutely no control over my body, over my life, and that I had to just completely submit and surrender myself and trust that these people would look after me, and if they couldn't, then this was how I was going to die. And I could feel gushing happening again and again, and I was worried that I was losing all my blood. And I became aware that an anaesthetist was telling me that he was about to put me to sleep, and one of his nurses was preparing the mask over my face to help me go off to sleep. But just before all that, there was a lady who introduced herself over the top of my head, and I couldn't see her, but I could hear her, and she said, "My name's Deb, and I'm a social worker, and I'm going to see you when you wake up." And for me to hear that at the very last minute before I was put to sleep did give me some hope that I would wake up.
Katrina did wake up, knowing her baby had died, and she was in a lot of pain. At the hospital, she was looked after in the gynecology ward.
So I don't think that the gynecology nurses knew how to broach the subject of my stillborn baby. They didn't ever voluntarily initiate any conversation about it. They didn't ever offer to arrange to have the baby brought to me. It's almost like they consciously avoided talking about Lydia for fear that it would upset me. And obviously I was tremendously upset. And at this point, after having 2 days for the information that she was stillborn to sink in, and the acute phase of my C-section resolving, I was feeling able to experience more emotional pain about it. And oftentimes I would be visibly upset and in tears, crying for her, and I feel that they said some quite insensitive things.
Like what?
One of the nurses told me that I should stop worrying because I'll have another one.
Another baby?
Yeah. And I didn't say anything, but I felt like, gosh, at this point I don't actually know if I can have another baby. How dare you say that? that doesn't make me feel better at all. At this point, I didn't want another baby. I just wanted Lydia.
The social worker Deb de Wilde saw this and suggested Katrina moves to the maternity ward where spending time with a stillborn baby is accepted.
Deb's approach is very central to the baby that you've lost, and she validates the baby that you've lost. She makes really beautiful comments and remarks about the baby that you've lost, and the focus is all about that baby, and she gives you compliments on how you're being a beautiful mum to your baby, irrespective of whether it's alive or dead. And that made me feel so much better because I felt like I was getting that chance to be Lydia's mum, and I was having the opportunity to demonstrate how I would have been her mother had she lived.
Katrina's last night with Lydia was precious.
So I stayed up very late with her in my room and tried to squeeze a lifetime of being her mum into 12 hours. So I held her a lot, just tried to remember the weight of her, the size of her, the look of her, the feel of her in my arms. And I played some DVDs, I read her stories, and I told her stories about her mum and dad, and I flipped through a photo album with her, and I played music to her in the morning so that I could associate the memory of her being with me with particular songs.
Lydia was buried the next day. Katrina is grateful to have met Deb de Wilde because she knows not all parents are given the opportunity to care for their stillborn. And this is the crux of the problem, says Victoria Bowring from the Stillbirth Foundation. The support for bereaved parents is a neglected area. The service parents get is a question of luck.
But it's very much dependent on the maternity unit itself and the midwives that are working in the various hospitals. There's very little in the way of formal training around stillbirth for midwives and nursing staff in the hospitals.
She says this kind of training is urgent and she can't understand why this isn't recognised.
We fight very hard to have it added to the national health agenda, but up until now we've not been terribly successful in maintaining that or getting the government to actually take it on board.
And that special health report on stillbirths and how they're dealt with by hospitals was prepared by Hagar Cohen with assistance from Joe Werner. Now, we approached Westmead Hospital for a response to the programme, and they claim that they do follow guidelines for dealing with both miscarriages and stillbirths, and they do it in a humane way. And they also claim that there's no record of a complaint by the family in question. I'm Norman Swan. This has been the Health Report. Look forward to your company next week.